Welcome to another episode of the Being and Doing podcast, where I'm trying to bring the uniqueness of the beings that are around me and bring their stories, which will hopefully inspire and stimulate your way of being and thinking. And today I'm joined by Vesna Goldsworthy, and I will just mention a few words that I have connected with her that came out of me reading and just getting to know her, which is authenticity, bravery, creativity, and adaptability. And I'm not sure if you would identify with any of these, but I'm curious what might be some which you identify with. And welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a huge pleasure to be your guest and to think about these things, because I do and I don't. So one of the things that you mentioned, you will have to remind me of those terms. But when you said bravery, I picked it up immediately because I relate to myself as brave in some ways always in the past. So I think that my 22, 23-year-old self who came to Britain in 1984-5 was terribly brave. Whereas I think that if I had to make the same decision in my 40s or my early 50s, maybe that bravery wouldn't necessarily apply. But then the question is, what is courage? What is bravery? I think of it as gumption, since we will be talking about synonyms. Gumption is more a kind of daring that comes from the gut rather than something that you think through. I discovered when I was 41, 42, and was being treated for cancer, that I have a lot more physical bravery than I thought I had, in a sense of the kind of pain threshold. My pain threshold is incredibly high. So we're already talking about two different kinds of courage. One is the courage to act in particular ways. One is the courage to suffer, to kind of withstand certain things. And in some ways, I used to think of myself as a physical coward, but I discovered that I'm not. So yeah, it's a kind of difficult thing to describe without quite sounding as though I'm boasting. But yes, the physical courage is definitely still there, whereas a certain amount of caution seeps through with the years. So the 23, 24-year-old that was incredibly courageous and in some ways even foolish is now perhaps more cautious. But then I think that's natural, because I was 62 yesterday. It's the day after my birthday. And when you're 62, you have much more at stake. I have a child, I have a home here, etc. So you also have much more to lose. Yeah, courage. I spent so long talking about courage. I'm not sure we want to speak about the others, but what did you say? Authenticity.
Yeah.
That is a lovely one, in a sense that I would like to write something about the meaning of authenticity. In what way could someone who belongs to two places equally, to two nations, to two languages, in what ways are you a kind of divided personality, and in what ways are you something unique? The sort of thing that I really think and write about, because identity is one of those things that I study, not in your sort of psychological or psychotherapeutical way, but more in this cultural way, which is about the representations of identity. So what kind of identity do I project? It's a kind of thing that I said. I was interviewed by Michael Barkley for Private Passions. And this is a program on Radio 3 where you choose your favorite music and classical music. And I chose quite a number of Serbian pieces because I was sort of trying to project that kind of, the sense of difference. But at the same time, I was talking about how sometimes when I'm in Belgrade, let's say this is kind of situation where you're sitting in a restaurant and the waiter gives you the menu in English. So what is it about me? Is it the clothing or is it the manner? And I actually think that it's the manner that through the decades becomes more English. You sort of, without trying, I definitely don't want to become that other, but that you smile, you gesture, you kind of, your attempt to be authentic is always undermined by kind of years of becoming something else.
That's interesting. I am sitting with that questions quite a lot, with that question of authenticity and what does it mean for my different identities, because even in Serbia, as my parents are Macedonian, it was very difficult to find that balance of what does it mean for me to be authentic when I have both. And am I inauthentic when I'm one or the other? And can I somehow bring them together and show them together? So, and then with all of that conflict, if you want, I've moved to Switzerland and then I moved to England, and then you wonder what are all these things that I've learned and different parts of me that have developed depending on this surrounding. Does that mean that when I'm in another place, I'm not authentic? So I'm actually quite curious. Did you manage to somehow reconcile them eventually and integrate them as being you and unique?
I think they were integrated very, very early on. And I think I was lucky in that sense, in part because I come from a Belgrade family where, unlike yours, there was no kind of experience of displacement other than going back 3 generations, which is what most of us in the Balkans have. But my grandparents settled in Belgrade after the First World War, and so I don't have that personal memory. It's a kind of 3rd generation. And at the same time, when I came to England, I was in an English family, again, without a kind of questioning thing. And the addition, which I think is very important, is that when you came here in the mid-80s, you didn't have that huge burden of the war behind you and having to account for. So most people, I wrote about this in Chernobyl Strawberries, in my memoir. I spent about 6 months in Paris when I was a student. And in Paris, there were so many workers from Serbia that almost everyone had some knowledge of the Serbs. So, the French would say, oh, my cleaner is from Serbia, or my manicurist is from Serbia. When I came to London, no one knew anyone from Serbia. If they knew people, they were really people like Tito or Draža Mihailović, or, the kind of abstract political figures. So I wasn't carrying that kind of burden of having to project a particular image. I could be myself and not have to explain. This was completely unavailable to the refugees and migrants in the 1990s, because the image of the war was preceding them, right? So if you said you're Serbian or Bosnian or whatever, people already had certain stereotypes in mind. So actually, for me, that was much easier, in a sort of sense that whatever image I projected was the image of both myself and my nation. It's quite relaxing in that sense. So I wasn't even thinking about it very much. I think my preoccupation was more to fit in the kind of educational background that I came with into the English, British templates. So I graduated in comparative literature. That doesn't quite exist as a discipline here. I didn't want to study or teach Slavonic literatures here because that seemed the minority. Why would you leave the main center for it to come and study that on the periphery? At the same time, I was too diffident almost scared about studying English literature, which is what I eventually did, because I thought they were all going to be better than me. So it was kind of fitting in that kind of sense, was more, required more thinking through than my personal identity and kind of ways of going about things day to day.
That's an interesting thing, and also in the way of what you think is available for you, because I also remember coming, to Switzerland, and also kind of hear the difference of who I could compare myself to and what I would think is available to me is different. And whenever I would go into a science field and I would see, who is the head of the lab, there would be no Serbian, but then the technician is Serbian or Croatian, or and then just this idea, I could be actually the leader of the lab, was almost unavailable as an option. I didn't have examples of that happening, and so it's quite amazing that you haven't had those examples, and then you still have made have been able to make space for yourself and to find your identity in a new place. So how difficult was that to not have a template and then still find your voice? And I think that also accounts for authenticity as well, and bravery.
It's a complex question in a sense that there are 2 or 3 layers there. One is that that in the practical sense, in terms of finding work, I somehow went about it axially, and sometimes accidents played a certain role. So, for example, my first jobs were in publishing, and literally the first 3 or 4 years in London. So there were ways in which I decided and had the luxury of not having to compromise. One was that I said, I'm not going to take a job I don't like and I wouldn't do in Belgrade, which is a luxury that you have when you join a family here. If I just migrated, I obviously wouldn't have had that. The second one was that I wasn't going to befriend people that I wouldn't be friends with back in Belgrade. Do you see what I mean? I had my standards, as it were, both. But in terms of work, to cut a very long story short, I got my first jobs because I studied Latin back in Belgrade. This is a kind of thing that you'd never expect. And it's a sort of accident, the way accident plays a role in our lives. So what happened was that there was an advertisement for a copy editor, which was asking for an editor on what is a doomsday book, an old English tax manuscript in a publishing house, and said, you must speak English and you must have the use of Latin, not speak Latin. So I had Latin from my gymnasium, and I thought, I'm going to apply for this and see what happens. And I got it because nobody else, it's an odd qualification. But if you told me in all of these dilemmas that I had, that my first job was going to depend on Latin, it's kind of strange. It's a bit like take an odd subject from your high school. But once I was in the publishing house, I could see where my strengths are. It's essentially, I had the foot in the door. And a lot of what followed can be explained by that, because I was working for a very prestigious place, even though in a minor capacity. And that gave me confidence to take a postgraduate course in English literature as opposed to what I discussed, etc., etc. So it's a kind of first step where there was a degree of luck. Sometimes when people in my homeland ask me about my career, they always think that I had some kind of help or some kind of backing, that there is some kind of secret conspiratorial, someone stands behind me. There's nothing. There's a little bit of luck. There's a little bit of luck and an awful lot of hard work, but the little bit of luck shouldn't be discounted. So that's the question of the professional, the career. The bigger question, and that is where perhaps there is a kind of element of loss, is writing, because I came to England with a degree of status as a young writer in Belgrade. And when I came here, effectively I lost that because it took the best part of a decade and a half before I was able to write in English in the way that you needed to write in order to have books published, etc., etc. And decade and a half is probably the equivalent of 3 or 4 books. So it's a sort of, in the kind of longue durée, you see my books, etc., and you don't think that there was that kind of dislocation, but there was. That, on the other hand, is the reverse of the story of authenticity and fitting in here, because where the 80s were lucky for me as an émigré, they were not lucky for me as a writer, in a sense that someone coming from former Yugoslavia now would have the immediacy of the internet, communication, whereas in the 80s you were cut off. If you made a phone call to Belgrade, it cost the equivalent of about £4 a minute. Everything had to be, if you sent a letter, before you heard back, it would be 2, 3, 4 weeks. So that sense of distance was massively detrimental for any continuation of writing in Serbian. That just dried up because I really felt cut off in a way that no one would feel cut off nowadays. That's where technology had changed the world.
Yeah, actually, I remember you saying that on the dinner where we met, and I remember I felt a sting. I felt like I do not acknowledge the privilege I have at this moment, and what it might have meant back then to be somewhere else, and how much, as you say, I think there is often in Serbia, there is, if someone succeeds in some way, there must be a conspiracy theory because there is something about, I guess, the learned helplessness that is present in the nation, that it just cannot be that I can do it by my own account. It must be something on a push. And so I felt, even in that moment, as I was listening to you, I remember on the dinner sitting there and thinking, that's brave. I mean, that is, I thought of the loss, actually, you might have had felt at that time, because that means if we speak about identity, you might have lost a huge part of your identity. And I'm curious, how was that grieving process in that time?
It was something that I probably felt not so much in the first years, because you come to a new place and you're setting up the home and you're finding your feet and, getting a kind of sense of the new place. But maybe 2, 3, 4 years into my being in London, I sort of realized how, in spite of the huge cultural richness that was on offer for me, certain circles were very reduced, because in Belgrade I knew everyone, and I could make a phone call or kind of go up to the main street and find all the contacts I needed. Here it was very difficult. I mean, I sort of, there was one moment which I gave to Milena, although The Iron Curtain, my latest novel, is in no sense autobiographical. The particular little scenes that I built from that experience, and one scene is where she has to make certain phone calls for work-related reasons, and she scripts every phone call in advance, because, in her head, even writing, taking notes for ordinary phone calls, because that kind of making of contact is so different when people don't know you. You lose that kind of footing, really. So in a sense, yes, it requires more courage, and yes, there were moments. The kind of homesickness. I'm not given to homesickness, really, but I'm not given to it now when, or the last 20 years, when you can go back 5 or 6 times a year if you want. But originally, it was much more expensive. And also there was a kind of sense of that it's dangerous if you're endlessly oscillating, that you will never fully grow your roots in the new place. So it's not as though I particularly wanted to keep going back there, but I did feel the loss of that.
Mm. And talking about identity and cultural identity, you kind of just surfacely touched on that, and I'm wondering, what do you understand under that term, and how do you study it from that point, rather than from what we think of parts of us as identities in the psychotherapy?
So I mean, I would have to, in some ways, throw back the question at you, because I'm not sure what you think of as identity in that kind of sense. But I think that it is not accidental that we talk about ethnicity or nationality or foreignness, although I could equally have started the conversation with motherhood or being a Londoner or being a woman of a certain age, etc., etc. So why do we kind of start off with ethnicity or nationality? And I think in part it's because you and I are talking, but in other part it's because I'm used to it, because in my work as a writer, that's what crops up again and again, even to the point of boredom, right? That this is what people ask you. And, now when I go to Serbia, because I have a degree of recognition, people don't ask that question so much. But I remember in 2005, I opened the Belgrade Book Fair as a British writer of Serbian origin, because at that stage I was better known as a British writer than as someone who is from Serbia, right? Whereas here, where I think I'm fully a British writer, I'm very often introduced as a Serbian writer, not because someone is trying to marginalize me, quite the opposite. It's because they like diversity. So it's a kind of you add the numbers in some ways. So if there are 5 of us by origin from different places, we would be introduced like that. So it's kind of, it's a sort of question that you're endlessly having thrown at you, because this is your differentia specifica, this is your difference, right? Rather than these other ones, sexuality, gender, profession. I could have said my identity is being a famous novelist or being a university professor or whatever, and yet here we are talking about nationality and language. And
that is actually a very, very good thing that you just said, because I often wonder whether that's also connected in the global world where we live in, where we are all other somehow different. And I also, since I came to England, I started realizing that it looks like there has been homogeneity in all these countries, but people have started traveling with, I don't know, Columbus, probably even before. And so there has been a lot of mixtures, and yet still we somehow cling to that sameness, that what is it that connects us? And in this case, what connects us is maybe being Serbian. So it's something we've started talking about. And I'm curious, how can we use these things not as a source of othering, not as a source of using that difference as something, oh, you're other, and kind of let's just not talk about that, or let's marginalize, as you just said, but actually contributing that from being unique in the way you are. I'm curious, what does it mean to live as a writer whose mother tongue is Serbian, has written in English and being translated in her mother tongue? I mean, it's a unique experience, regardless of your origin and nationality. And so I think it's that question that I'm always sitting with, is how do we speak about difference without using that difference as a political weapon?
It's so in my particular case, the kind of going away from politics, not that I have any problems with politics, but I'm not particularly interested or political in that kind of primary sense in terms of day politics. But the language is interesting because the moment I like that Derridian thing, which is, you know, in deconstruction, they call mise en abîme, those mirrors. If you look into a mirror, you see a mirror to infinity where, you know, each one. So the moment you pin down a difference, it slightly moves and escapes. It's a kind of, it becomes something else. So if I am Serbian here or Serbian British, when I'm in Belgrade, I can no longer, I mean, Serbian doesn't mean anything because I'm surrounded by the Serbs. So I'm Belgradian, but Belgradian doesn't mean anything. So I'm from a particular part of Belgrade. That's that kind of infinity. I think our identity and the kind of attempt to define it is almost inescapable. Mm-hmm. And what I'm trying to say is that the othering will take place at a more micro level, be it political, be it, that's kind of the way we define ourselves. In terms of language and translation, it is actually interesting. So I partly described the reasons which led me gradually to start writing in English. But as time goes by, I'm also very, very aware that I no longer have a perfect language. When I came to this country, French is my main foreign language. So this is something I studied from very early childhood, and yet now it's rusted. And English sort of became better and better. My Serbian is still fine, but in some ways it's dated. So when I write, I either have this kind of slightly rusty, archaic Serbian, you know, circa 1976, or I have this ever improving English, but which is always slightly imperfect because it's not my mother tongue. And the imperfection is perhaps not so much in making mistakes. I don't make mistakes. I correct English people's English because I studied grammar, etc. But it is in a certain, how can I say, artificial linking between the between what we are saying and what is in our heads. And I will explain this in case it's so. Wystan Auden, W.H. Auden, the poet, talked about the child learning the language. And when you learn your first language, he says something like, and the child says moon and sees the moon and thinks that the word is the thing, that there is this primal connection in your first language between the word and the object, which in your subsequent languages is always slightly artificial. So I feel, for example, that in English I can write about sex without having any taboos or inhibitions. But when I write in Serbian, taboos come in because the words mean particular things and images. There's a kind of distance or artificiality that gives me more freedom in English, but at the same time is also slightly flattening, if you see what I mean. It's a kind of, there's a double play there. It's a, we foreigners play with the language more because we are freer, but that original link is actually something important. You know, if you say strawberry in English, and if you say jagoda, which one calls a more vivid image? It's always your mother tongue that does.
That I haven't thought about that about language, because I am thinking that it is formed at a time where the cognitive brain is not developed in the same way that it is now when we are learning it again, and there is something about, yeah, what are the affects, what are the emotions that are connected. And I was just I had my sister over, and then we were speaking in Serbian, and we were also smelling the smells of strawberries. And it is so interesting how it doesn't transport me to London. It transports me to, the small piazza, the small market. Even the word piazza is not the same. It's not the same as the borough market.
No. That is precisely why I found it difficult to think about translating my own work into Serbian, because I felt, so when I was translating Gorsky, my novel, which is the only complete book that I translated, I was very often tempted to rewrite the descriptions because they were evoking different things. It's not about being dissatisfied or censoring certain things. It's about precisely those sort of the weights that the words carry. So Chernobyl Strawberries, the memoir, begins precisely with the image you evoked now, which is sitting in a tramway in Belgrade and feeling the smell of strawberries wafting through the window. And it's a kind of peculiar thing. It's it's the way the memory and it's the Proustian moment, to put it simply, but it is entangled in language.
Yeah, and I'm curious. We are starting to speak about language, and that is one of the reasons we came together, which is to explore those intricacies of what does it mean to be bi-trilingual? What does it mean to write in a different language? Where are those languages stored, and what are we expressing to one or the other? So maybe you want to say something, who you are, or maybe you want to explore who you are in different languages and what parts of you come through. And actually, I think this, in the next question, might be touches the work on translation, and that was one of my favorite subjects when we were doing linguistics in high school. Was it's really translating is to some extent recreating the work in the new language.
I like the fact that the original meaning of the word translation is literally carrying over, as in, translating the bones of the saints, carrying over the bones of the saints from one place to another. In Greek, translation, what are they? Those big lorries that carry furniture, removal vans, I suddenly lost the word because I was thinking of Greek. This is something that I will mention. They have the sign metaphora. Metaphora is translation. So metaphora and translation are the same words, meaning literally carrying over. And for me, it is interesting that in the origins, the etymology of the word, there's something that's very physical, right? That is the carrying over. And that physicality is what I was trying to describe with my moon image, that you sort of feel that. Now, the whole essence of bilingualism and what was happening just there when I lost the word is interesting because of this. When I speak in English, I very rarely lose words. But when I try to I don't know how our brains work. This is I'm not a neuroscientist. But when I try to think in two languages at the same time, I endlessly have these short-circuiting moments. And it's usually not when the Serbian and English are in question, but when a third language interferes. So, for example, I once tried to give an interview in French. My French is still very good, but I kept apologizing in English. Somehow French and English interfere and stop me. It's a kind of, where are these things stored in our minds, right? It's fascinating. I'm also aware that languages carry, and this is something that I often speak about, their own aesthetic burden. So something that is a beautiful verse of poetry in Serbian, if you translate it in English, sounds kitsch or sounds too ornate. right? Similarly, when you translate in English, many English writers translated into Serbian fall flat. It sounds quite ordinary and mundane. Different aesthetic work through. And in some ways, once you're a bilingual writer and you're aware of both, that becomes an impediment, because you would try either to embellish or to reduce, right? When I notice when I translate other people's, I translate some Serbian poets into English, I'm very often tempted to edit them because I want that different aesthetic. The bilingualism is a different question, though not unconnected. As you live in a country over many years, you acquire layers of language. And sometimes I compare my mind to an archaeological dig where whole layers exist in one language and not in the other. And sometimes I use the image of a car, because I learned to drive in this country. And I didn't know a lot about machines back in Belgrade. And so to this day, if you look at the car from the outside, I can name all the parts in Serbian. But the moment you lift the hub, it's all English, right? Or I learned to cook in this country. So even some very ordinary kitchen utensils, I have no names for them in Serbian, right? And when I remember when my mother was sort of coming here and she would suddenly name something, and I said, "Oh, that's what it's called." You know, it's sort of something quite ordinary I never had in Serbian. So this is a kind of way in which that complementarity means that it's not two perfect layers, but two porous layers where one thing exists only in English, one thing exists only in Serbian. And I once heard a woman in my local supermarket, a Bosnian woman, speaking on a mobile phone to someone, and she said, "Os chicken ili lamb," like Yiddish. Do you want chicken or lamb? But she only used the auxiliary words in her mother tongue. And I thought that's such an image. It's very funny because that's such an image of how this kind of immigrant language experience come to be, that even the ordinary things are replaced.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I was thinking there was a time for me when I was, as long as I'm not intuitive in a language, I actually translate from Serbian to English to the third language. So there was a time when I was translating from Serbian to English to French. But then when I became quite immersed in French and stopped thinking about, then it came directly from Serbian to French. And so it's really interesting to see how the best second language then not interferes, but actually supports the learning of the third. And also, I find it, we spoke about this, about the aesthetics of the language, and I guess you would call it porous, but there is for me something about richness, being able to have, there is a woman who said, when a language dies, a way of seeing the world dies with it. And there is something about being almost like you have your toes dipped in different ways of perceiving the world, which language brings. And I'm wondering, what do you tap into in terms of experience or of emotion when you tap into the different languages, different aesthetics, and when you speak them or think on them? And which language do you dream on? That's actually what I would like to hear.
I'm often asked that, and the honest thing is I don't know. Those who heard me speak in my sleep, those people very close to me, say that I say things like rhubarb, rhubarb. You know, in English, that's the kind of expression you use when you talk nonsense, i.e. that it's not a particular language. But I don't know. Probably some and some, probably both, probably none. Do we dream in specific languages? I don't know. It's my friend Elena Lapin wrote a memoir about dreaming in about 3 or 4 languages. I don't know. I did a program for the BBC about multilingualism and the way we function and what is left when we start losing the language, as you described. What your quote relates to is a communal sense of language loss. So that, let's say, if there is a small community of speakers of a particular language and then English takes over and that language dies, but there is also the personal loss of language, which sometimes happens when people become demented, for example. Mm-hmm. I've had cases of, so for example, I have a friend whose father was a speaker of English and Welsh, and because he was Welsh originally, when as he aged, he lost his English and could only speak Welsh, and his children could no longer speak to him because they didn't speak Welsh. And that is for me scary. My son speaks Serbian, but not so well. And that was a huge impetus, or rather a matter of huge happiness, when he started actively learning Serbian. But what I see now with him, as his Serbian is much more fluent and as it improves, is another part of answer to your question, is that he can suddenly tap into certain moods that don't exist in English. You know, like he would listen to a song, Serbian song on YouTube, and you can suddenly see that the kind of blues that you feel when you listen to a Serbian song is a different sentiment from the kind of blues that you feel when you listen to a sad English song. It's a kind of different emotional response. And he suddenly gained a kind of access to that emotion, which comes with the language, right? It's very funny because he listens to the kind of what I call gastarbeiter music, which I don't listen to, but I find it fantastic that he does. I really love it. And that he would get that kind of sense of sadness, even though that's not his world, purely through language and through music.
Mm-hmm. And also, I was curious about becoming a mother, and how did that change you, and what has that brought for you in your experience?
This is not something that it's a work in progress. This is not something that is very easy to think about, but you are a kind of diplomatic representative of both sides, and children go through phases. And you see here again, I'm talking about national identity. There are all sorts of other identities. Becoming a mother of a boy, that you, first of all, I'm a feminist, and I want my boy to be brought up with a particular respect for women, but at the same time, I also want him to be a kind of tough and sporty and et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of, you have this negotiation of gender, and then you have the negotiation of ethnicity, which is interesting because as a parent, you have very little control. But I saw the phases as he was growing up, and I don't want to make this too personal. You have the phases when children want to belong. So when he was kind of, in some ways, covering his otherness, and that is particularly when children are 7, 8, 9, they want to be part of a group. And then you have the phase when he's 16, 17, 18, when you want to be interesting for the girls, etc. When suddenly his otherness becomes exotic and something to be proud of, and then it's highlighted almost. So what I saw with him is quite interesting, which is how a person grows up when they have two halves, when they belong to two nations. Because in a sense, I don't have those two halves, I'm an overlapping story of identity, but acquired, whereas he's born into both.
And also seeing him grow up, and what did that inform you about your childhood, and what have you seen in that development that kind of evoked some of the history that you came with here?
Oh, that's a very difficult question, because what I would say is that in some ways, perhaps more present on my mind is a kind of idea of Serbian Balkan parenthood as very enveloping, in a sense of, to this day, I want to cook for him, or I want to make sure that he goes out dressed appropriately for the weather. Whereas a lot of English mothers kind of think about independence differently, setting them out of their ways. So it's a sort of, it's actually quite funny, because a lot of those things about my parents that seemed in some ways kind of controlling and overbearing, that I was longing to escape, I see myself fitting into that pattern as a mother. And it is, but at the same time, it's a different place, different century. You have to let go. He was in Colombia and Mexico traveling for about 2 months last month. And it brought memories of my mother being terribly scared when I was about 17 or 18, and I would buy an Interrail ticket and go off to Norway and then go off to Morocco, etc. But also, I remember that in those days, because there was no mobile telephony, you would just disappear for a month and then return. Whereas we now expect our children to be in contact every day or so. So it's a sort of, he has more freedom to travel, but he also has more restriction because of the new ways of communicating. Poor children, what can I say? I don't, in a way, I'm improvising this answer because I haven't really thought about it coherently. But actually, I don't think that the degrees of freedom and the ways I was growing up in the 70s would be that different. The technology has changed, but I have a feeling that we are a very similar generation. It's a sort of, there was a much greater chasm between my parents' experience and mine than there is between my son's experience and mine, in a sort of sense that they had the experience of the Second World War. They had the huge traumas of that. And I didn't have that. My life is more similar to my son's than my life is to my parents' life.
That is, I think, actually, as I started doing psychotherapy, I started thinking about time really differently, in a sense that even the 70s that you lived in Serbia, for example, might be completely different than the 70s that my parents lived, or as in that the same time can be also for some people even 100-year difference, although they live in the same year era or something. So I find it really different. I find it very interesting recently to think of time and how we seemingly live into 2023. And yet the span is plus minus 100 years, maybe.
That some people are still living in the 19th century and some people are way ahead. And it is not just as simple as material conditions, but mindset, religion, religious restrictions, family structures, etc. In that sort of sense, I wrote about this in Chernobyl Strawberries. My parents were yuppies. They were sort of university educated, and they had their attitudes formed by that post-war era. And it is very difficult to quite relate to that, because in some ways the 1990s in ex-Yugoslavia were going back towards a more conservative attitudes, that people were recreating some kind of idealized sense of a conservative bourgeois world, which then meant a very, when I read an article about, I don't know, people in the main square in Zagreb protesting against abortion. It's not something I recognize. It's not, it's a kind of, or we had conversely, I was talking about that 2 days ago, actually because we were remembering Dubravka Ugrešić, who was a dear friend of mine who died this year. And it was about the Yugoslav feminism in the 70s and 80s. And in 1984, a group of American feminists came to my university to talk about US feminism with a completely distorted sense of who they were talking to, because what they were sort of talking about was a sense of professional liberation, which was completely displaced in a sense that what all the women that were listening to them had was precisely professional equality. They were, PhDs, university teachers, scientists, whatever it is, but their inequalities were perhaps at home because the family structures were patriarchal, whereas the Americans were kind of talking about American feminism as though they were trying to teach us a certain lesson, which is ridiculous because they had fewer rights at work than we did in the 80s, right? It's a kind of, and that's part of your question about living different eras at the same time, that without judging anyone, that having a preconception can very often lead you to a mistaken conclusion.
Yeah, and I'm grateful that you've mentioned that, and I think it a little bit connects to Ruritania, and you called it the imperialism of imagination, which I really like. And for me, there is always that sense that we are coming to teach you something, rather than the idea of exchange, and that is something that I'm missing when it comes to that hierarchical relationship of West to East, or whatever hierarchical relationship is, because I've listened to one podcast where a Gestalt therapist, they went to, I think, Mexico, and they were there to build together with some indigenous tribes, and although they had some knowledge that what they were building might not be stable enough or something, but they were still there to learn from each other and there be in the place as it is in that time and space, because they will eventually leave to their own homes, which are living in a completely different structure and society. And I think there is something about that, I don't know, not aggression, or like not this idea, I came here to bring you what I know of you or what I think you should know, rather than that exchange. And I'm wondering, what is your experience now that you are a teacher as well? How do you teach, knowing that you can also learn from your students?
It's so to start with Ruritania, what was very interesting for me, and I spent the best part of 10 years working on that book. I started in the late 80s because, in part, what drove me was this desire to see how I, coming from this part of the world, may be seen by the others. And what interested in me, unlike quite a lot of scholars, is what do you know about the Balkans when you think you don't know anything, right? It's a kind of, so in the position of ignorance, what is that kind of kernel of knowledge that you have? And what was interesting was that the British literature had produced this kind of massive body of writing purely for entertainment that then projects itself onto the real place. And because the entertainment industry is so powerful, as a series of images is more powerful than whatever comes from that place. Okay, so the example I use is Bram Stoker's Dracula very often, because this kind of vampiric image is so well known that children will know about it long before they start reading. And in turn, you have this problem that Romanians have, and I had a kind of advisory role on that, which was, what do you do with Dracula? When the tourists come there and there is no there, what do you offer? Because you kind of, you want to make money out of tourism, but you also, it's a complete imposition, right? For former Yugoslavia, a good example, a similar example, is Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express, which takes place in Vinkovci. And in her world, although she knew it better, there are huge mountains there, although it's a flat land. And so if you're making a film about Vinkovci based on Murder of the Orient Express, you'd completely distort the image. This seems rather innocent, but it can have very pernicious effects, because it impacts the way you see the other. And you may see the other as this kind of Gothic threat, like the vampires, or you may see the other as a kind of collection of children, as the kind of Ruritanian stories are based on that somehow the Balkans are naive, a bit primitive, When you then make political decisions based on that, it becomes very, very dangerous, because the kind of knee-jerk thing is, oh, they need me to go as an English person or as a Belgian person or as a German person to go there and sort them out. The idea of intervention from the outside. And I very recently spoke about, for example, since you mentioned that you're from Macedonia, the whole idea of Western Balkans is the way the map is changed by that imagination, because Western Balkans do not exist. What you're talking about is someone putting some circle on the map, like a hole in a bagel, right? Where at best it may be Central Balkans or what? I don't know. It's a creation of a region by Western imagination, right? It's a kind of thing. And so this was the primary goal of my research, was to show how certain things that appear innocent because they're made for entertainment permanently alter your idea of the region, your perception of the region. And anything that comes from the region actually has huge problems competing with that. There is nothing that is produced in the Balkans that can be ever as well known as Dracula, because it's this kind of huge entertainment industry has worked on this for decades now. So what you used with your example of that sort of gestalt is a very rare example where people will go trying to learn certain things from the region. And in literature, the rare examples that I found are examples of writers like Rebecca West. So what Rebecca West did was, she was looking at, this is described in Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, she was looking for a country that would be a good example for her to study as a bulwark against imperialism, against Western imperialism. And at first, how do you resist it? And at first she chose Finland, but she saw, and she even started learning Finnish, but she saw that when she went to Finland, it wasn't a good example for her. So she went to Yugoslavia, and what she found in Yugoslavia is a kind of proto-European, mini-European Union, that the little alliance of people was actually protecting its own culture through that. And this is what her work is about. So she really went with completely open mind, not having any prejudice or, if she had any prejudices, she put them to one side, and she was speaking to people and learning. And as a result, you have this magnificent work because she speaks to Anita Savić-Rebac, who is a famous classicist. She speaks to Hasan Rebac, who is a very famous translator, to Stanislav Vinaver, the Jewish Serbian poet. And you have this kind of real treasure trove of a book, but there aren't many like that. Very few people are open-minded in that way. So when you ask me how I teach, this is your answer. I try to give them some of those books and hope that something will catch. If it does or doesn't, I don't know.
And I'm also curious about feminism and you being a woman. And it's interesting that you're speaking to 70s, and I was in school in the 90s and 2000s, and how it was a really interesting thing being a woman in Serbia and growing up there and being educated there, and also all the layers that I had to peel off to actually feel free. Although I was physically free, I did not feel free. And I'm wondering what did it mean for you, and what does it mean now to be a woman, and do you feel free, and how did you fought for your own freedom?
That's a very interesting and difficult question, in a sense that much as I said that I thought about my national identity an awful lot, this is not something that I really, although at particular points here in Britain, I was involved in excavating lost Balkan voices. So I translated work of women poets, or I lectured about women writers from former Yugoslavia that were largely forgotten, but not in this kind of theorizing, thinking through sense, more in a kind of literary sense. So let me think about this. It's actually difficult because there is something in me that is inclined to think about the condition of former Yugoslavia in a very positive way in terms of the position of women. That I never grew up, unlike my English counterparts or British counterparts of the same age, with the idea that some colleges are women only, or a slightly older generation that you can't go to particular clubs because you're a woman. Or, in the early 60s here, you still needed your husband's permission to have a bank account. My grandmother would have been shocked by that. So there's a kind of way in which the former Yugoslav womanhood was fantastically progressive, both before the Second World War and certainly after the Second World War with socialism. But I also resist idealizing that, because I'm aware that there's this kind of layer of Yugo nostalgia, particularly my generation, which has the meaning that I also resist. Because if it was so great, why did it fall apart? Why did we have those terrible wars, which were very often about also repression and direct oppression of women? I don't know. There's something about the transition from socialism back to this kind of liberal capitalism that made quite a lot of our nations in former Yugoslavia, but also in the rest of the socialist world, kind of go back to some kind of imagined, idealized state of national history, which is also an illusion and a pipe dream, but which is oppressing women, in kind of seeking for some very traditional roles. So I'm not making sense. I'm circling around this because I'm aware that I have ambivalent attitudes here, that there is a kind of ambivalence, that part of me thinks, I really, being a woman was never a problem in my life. It wasn't, I didn't face any obstacles because of that. If I faced certain obstacles, perhaps as a mother, much later in Britain, it is because the role of a parent is very difficult in this country, just in terms of very mundane things like childcare. And, when you're sort of growing up in socialism and you have kindergartens that are practically free of charge and grandmothers that are at your disposal for, it's a kind of here, that sort of, but that's a slightly different question, I think.
Yeah. But there is actually that is the thing that even you just said, like grandmothers that would come to care for the child, and that's something that was an assumed role almost, which is basically unpaid labor or labor that is not recognized, that is free. And a friend of mine, I don't know who I talked to, she was like, well, capitalism going to really, it's like, this is the last generation where we have those grandmothers who might give us a hand. Soon those will be working grandmothers, they won't have that time, and then we will truly realize what was the unpaid labor that we assumed that should be there, that we never really valued. And I think that it's in those invisible things that I think is what is expected from a woman.
Absolutely. And the moment you say it, or even as I was saying it, that ambivalence kicks in. Yeah. because the only reason my mother offered a degree of that, she came to London for the best part of 2 years when my son was small, was that she retired very early. But she had a very responsible position in a big company. And when she retired, she should have gone traveling, not come here to look after my child. So in a way, I'm grateful, but I also, because I'm from where I am, in a sense expected it.
That's it. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a kind of yeah. This is what I said earlier, that you have this kind of world where we come from, where the equality at the workplace is achieved, but the patriarchal expectation is something that women carry themselves.
Yes.
It's that you kind of martyr yourself willingly, and in some senses, if that is taken away from you, if that is your expectation, is also sad. Because I have this experience of the street where I grew up in Belgrade, which is actually full of women just a little bit older than me, whose children had emigrated, and who via that kind of emigration have been deprived of that role, that they were sort of expecting that they would be there with grandchildren, etc. So it's a difficult one, you were talking about, yes, they will be in work, but at the moment there is this kind of transitional generation, which, I don't know how to, I don't know how to address that.
Yeah, I do hear that if there is an imagination of what my role will be, there is also a loss and a sadness in needing to reinvent oneself when that role is not there. And I guess that's the difficulty of living in this day and age. And it's not only difficulty for women. I imagine it is also for men, where the roles are not known, and therefore there is much more negotiating happening. There is much more necessity for true self-knowledge, whereas before I felt it was a bit more automatic. You would the expectations were set at the start. But I do recognize that, well, even in my mom and in her expectations from me, that it's like, this I think is my role, therefore this should be your role for me to be able to fulfill what I need to fulfill. So I do think there is a huge complexity in and change and transition in what's happening with those imagined identities, imagined roles. I don't know how I would call them.
My mother-in-law, my husband's mother, took up painting, and so she would go to France, and she was a talented painter. We have quite a lot of her paintings. Although by education she's a history graduate, and my mother, who is a law graduate, thought painting in retirement is sad. because what is not sad is looking after your grandchildren. This is the kind of preconditioning that we are discussing. It's really I don't know how I would think about it now. Obviously I will be writing, so that's different, but maybe in my case, it's resolved by the fact that I had my son so late that by the time he has children, I probably won't be around to have to worry about whether I look after them or write a novel.
Well, let's hope
that sounds sad, but in fact, I was just being jokey and cynical.
Yeah, but actually, when it comes to writing, there's one thing that I'm pondering for myself. So I'm curious, how was your process? But I'm noticing as I'm writing, and I try to write automatically just to see what comes up. But then I'm noticing there are layers of, and this is very historical for me, is that there was a moment where my dad read my diary, which I think really made me censor everything I write afterwards. Therefore, it was very difficult to be raw. And so so basically I trained my brain to write only finished thoughts, finished sentences, something that wouldn't offend, something that might be read. And so I'm noticing that I don't feel authentic. I really feel like I need to break through as I'm writing. So I'm curious, what was your process of finding that authenticity in the writing voice and not censoring?
Okay, so I have 2-3 observations there. First of all, I giggled while you were sort of telling your story there, because I remember my grandfather, my mother's father, staying with us in Belgrade and reading my sister's diary without any inhibition in front of us. He just sort of took it and read it, right? And he laughed. And so that was a kind of equivalent moment to yours. But also the fact that in our family life, the word privacy, I don't even know that it translated in those people's minds. It's a kind of, does the word privatnost, privacy in Serbian, it doesn't mean the same thing, right? Because our children have their spaces invaded all the time. And it's the most difficult balance to get right, because you have some terrible case in Belgrade at the moment of a kind of boy mass murderer, where they say, did his parents know what he was doing? And it's a horrible sort of thing, because yes, in some ways as a parent, you have to know, but in other ways you have to kind of stay out. And to negotiate that is horribly difficult. But in my generation, it was probably like in yours, you just didn't think of privacy. No, it's a sort of everything you did, if you had a diary or whatever, was as if for public consumption, because your privacy was invaded all the time. And if you wrote performatively, to recite, to speak, to be read by school teachers, etc., etc. So what you're talking about, we can discuss this in English, but it actually would be not something that I would even have thought about when I was younger. When I was writing Chernobyl Strawberries, that's a kind of moment when somewhere at the beginning of the memoir, I say, and a lot of people have asked me about this, so it's a good moment to explain. I say, I hope this memoir will never be translated into Serbian, right? And I wrote that as a way of removing the inhibition, precisely. And the way of removing the inhibition, because in part, for my generation, in my home country, talking about breast cancer was taboo. The naming of cancer was taboo. You know, you would say he died of a cruel disease rather than, so the fact that I wrote about that was taboo. But more strangely for me, and more cheerfully in some ways, is that I sensed that writing about my parents, my father, my mother, with the kind of boundless love that I felt for them, was also taboo for me, precisely because I grew up with this kind of slightly wooden attitude, in part to protect myself from their excessive feeling, you know, that kind of thing. I wasn't someone who would go to my mother and kind of hug her and say, I love you, because that would be to give her permission to, you know, it's really
to love you 10 times back.
exactly. To kind of be completely suffocated by the excess of emotion. So you kind of kept yourself protected by a degree of coldness, like almost like a permanent teenager. You know, that sort of thing, that I was an adult woman, but I was also that kind of teenager. And so I said, I hope this will not be translated into Serbian, simply because then I could write whatever I wanted to write about them, which was, if you said this in English, people would think that you were going to write some kind of dreadful things about your parents. In my case, no, it was just those really loving portrayals. But still, my mother felt at one point that certain things that I said about her were private, that I shouldn't have said them. And I said, like, for example, what? And she said, like, why did you have to write that I wear size 3 shoes? Size 3 being 35 in Serbian. She had very small feet. And she felt that that was a private detail. It's, you know, you kind of, if you write, you run into other people's notions of privacy. I shared my office with Hanif Qureshi for a long time, because we were teaching together at Kingston University. And I remember Hanif saying, and this is a writer without inhibitions, he really breaks taboos all the time, that if you're writing autobiographically, you have to go in the direction of danger, write about that which scares you. I never wrote like that. I don't have that kind of. I do that in novels, but not in writing about myself in nonfiction, because simply I'm not that kind of writer. And I think partly being former Yugoslav and being in this situation that you described, with people reading your diaries, kind of got that out of my system when I was too young to know any different.
So it's quite interesting, and actually in the size 35, I think that there is something about interesting about Serbia. It's kind of a paradox. It's we talk about everything without talking about the important stuff, and so we are able to talk about sex openly. We are able to talk openly, whatever that means. But somehow we do not talk about openly. And it's interesting that, as you said, your story of having breast cancer is how is it that we have that immediacy, neposrednost, I don't know if that's the good translation. How is it that we have that immediacy that in a way is not immediacy, it's a protection. And what helped you then to do it in English, and what was the liberation necessary to do that?
The liberation necessary to do that in some ways is inscribing yourself into a very different tradition. That the moment I was writing in English, this book had a kind of antecedents that I was aware of that made it not, that made it, that made the approach different than it would be if, so if I were writing in Serbian, the very question of being 42 and writing your memoirs would be a bit strange, because in Serbian, who writes memoirs? Politicians, generals, you know, people whose lives have certain kind of historical weight. Yeah. Similarly, the whole kind of way in which I approached the question of structuring of the memories, grouping them together, selecting, was very much part of the kind of British memoir tradition. So that, yeah, I was already teaching and reading those books, and that made it in some ways easier to think about the way in which I would structure and present my life. The difficulty was in translating certain events into English, because I grew up in that sort of society where, you know, the particular, I mean, I write, for example, about the celebrations of Tito's birthday, slet. What is the appropriate word? It's a bit like you sort of said, neposrednost. I don't know. It's a kind of, it was a fantastic experience. And I think in some ways, the Serbian audience is, the Serbian readership is maybe only now, your generation, relating to that book, Chernobyl Strawberries, in the way I would have expected for it to be read. And I think it is because a lot of that work has now been translated into Serbian, you know, like Annie Ernaux, the French writer, or the English autobiographers, so that I think now your generation there knows what I was doing in the 90s. It's a kind of it's a kind of strange thing in a sort of sense. I wouldn't say in any sense that I was ahead of my time, but I was just contextually in a different place, which is now clear. And in a way which, for example, my mother couldn't quite, although she's a very keen reader, couldn't quite kind of get what I was doing with that life story. She loved it, but it was kind of, what is this? You know, it's sort of, it's very, it's a very different context.
And what did you try to do with that life story? Sorry for not knowing this, but did you write it at the time when you had the cancer, or when?
Yes.
You survived?
What was happening was that when I was in the winter of 2003, when I was first diagnosed, I had these. So I was already the author of Inventing Ruritania, and the kind of writer and public figure, because I was working for the BBC at that stage, who was set on a certain cultural project. And this was very personal and very different. But what happened was that when I was diagnosed, there were particular elements of the treatment that made it look as though I was not going to live very much longer. And I started writing certain little stories and notes, essentially with the sense of a legacy, something to leave for my son, because he was then 2, and because I thought that there should be some kind of story of mine that is just a kind of, as though I was there telling him about it. And then as my health improved and there were particular treatments that proved successful, I rather liked the way in which writing those memories was taking me out of myself. And so I used the image, which is absolutely true, which was that I had this huge turban because I was on chemotherapy, and I was at a keyboard in a situation where most people are depressed. I was actually laughing because I was remembering certain things. So the memories of my growing up, my youth, etc., were taking me out of myself. And I enjoyed that project so much that I decided to just continue, except that instead of writing for one boy, I was now writing a book, but I was trying to keep the immediacy of the voice that I achieved when I was writing it for Alexander. And I think that was part of the success of the book. And I remember, so in Germany, when it came out, I had 14 editions in German in 2005. And so I was going there, and there was this TV program. It was serialized here. And I said, so what is the secret of this book? And they said, because it's a normal book, because Yugoslavia had all these really accounts of trauma. And there was this personal story going through sort of school and childhood and youth, and it's a kind of it's an interesting sort of thing, because precisely the thing that was healing for myself in the process of writing was then what made people respond to it.
And that's interesting, because I think there is a lot of resilience in our I wouldn't say in the region. I would like to say in the region, because I also remember, I was in the war, and it's interesting how even people who talk about trauma say, it's much scarier for the people who haven't experienced it than sometimes for the people who have gone through it. Because I do remember the war, and there are some incredibly difficult things, or the bombing, not the war. There were some incredibly difficult things that were happening for me, because my dad was a military doctor. But then, in a way, I also remember moments where I was driving the bike in the villages around the town I lived in, or when we were gathering and playing basketball. And there is also something interesting about, I think, growing up in Serbia, how much we choose to show to ourselves even only those terrifying images of
Mm.
violence, and how we by doing so. And I'm speaking this because I mean I loved our Chitanka. I don't know how to like our books are, well, high school literature books.
It's actually, Chitanka is untranslatable in that sort of sense.
Yeah.
Textbook would be the closest, but it's not quite.
Yeah. Well, textbook for literature subject.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's say it like that. And I love them. I have them still at home, all four of them from high school, because to me they are in themselves, they are a work of art. And but there is something about all those images and memories and what is the canon in Serbia. It's like I remember the poem The Pit from Ivan Goran Kovačić, or I remember the death of the mother Jugović. I don't know how it's translated in English, or Hasanaginica. It's a lot of terror. It's a lot of and then at times I actually read Miroslav Antić, which is like some sort of polarity of that. And it's also what we choose to regurgitate historically in the country as well outside of the country, which then I think also regurgitates a bit of keeping us in that trauma space. And it feels like you have chosen something else for yourself.
So my generation is very much in the kind of ambiguous shed of the Second World War, in a sense that we are our equivalents had a lot of texts, poems, stories of the Second World War, which were very graphic. You mentioned some like Ivan Goran Kovačić, etc., really sort of difficult and traumatic. But at the same time, what I now think is actually how many taboos we had about the Second World War. Part of the conflict of different nations in the 1990s was to do with these sort of repressed memories. So that's a kind of, and when my nephew and niece, who were born in the 1990s, so there was this kind of interregnum between my generation and yours, when they actually had a lot of ecological texts, about polluted rivers, etc. I rather like that. It's before the next the next narrative had settled. Really, it's and it is interesting in that sort of sense, because there is no equivalent in Britain, in that we had set texts nationally. There was a kind of curriculum which was right across the nation. So it was a kind of collective thing in Serbia or in Croatia, etc. Whereas here, it's sort of small groups of schools would have one lot of texts, and then another group of schools would have another lot of texts. And so when you mentioned what you were reading, I relate to those, because my school was studying the same thing. In England, it would be well nigh impossible, because if your Chitanka had poem X, mine would have had something completely different, even if we were the same age, because the whole sort of idea of a canon had been erased or undermined. You know, there's no kind of play by Shakespeare that everyone has to read, or and that does influence the sort of sense of identity as well.
That is actually really interesting. I didn't know that, because I thought everyone does the same like we do.
No. I teach English literature at Exeter University, and I have been teaching English literature for 20 years now. And one of the things that you have when you have, luckily enough, I now teach postgraduates, but when I was teaching undergrads, one of the things that you have is this difficulty of relating things that you're teaching to their set reading from school, because they come from all the different things. So you kind of, as a professor, you have to follow and know that, you know, they may have read Of Mice and Men, or they may have read something completely different. But, you know, you sort of mentioned The Mother of Jugovic, or you mentioned Yama, or whatever. There is nothing like that is uniting these groups. So in terms of national cohesion, it is actually quite interesting. In my parents' generation, my mother told me that they not only studied the same things, but they studied them at the same time, because there was a kind of educational program that went through month by month. So up and down Yugoslavia, you would be studying certain things in May and certain things in June, etc., etc. It's quite funny.
Yeah, I didn't know. I didn't even know of that. But yeah, that is interesting. And I guess it's quite rich to have students that have read different things, because that then opens up the worldview rather than closes it down. And for me, it was more like my own insatiable curiosity for what is there, what is this world like, that led me to read all these things. But I guess if it would be quite interesting who I would be if I just stick to what was canonical or what was outlined for me. And it took me, I don't know, again, a word that I cannot really fully translate, but it's uravnilovka, is that thing that we're, it's not equality, it's equalizer. It's something
equalizing is it's a well-known it's a well-known socialist concept at a particular stage in the development of communism and socialism. You even had the idea that everyone should have an equal salary, not just the equal education.
Yeah. Interesting. So I think we are slightly kind of closing. Like, I feel like we have touched a lot of topics. I would like to just briefly touch on your experience of going through cancer, because I imagine it has been something rich, not in a good way, or maybe also in a good way. But I wonder, what is it that has kept you going? And what is it that how is it that it has changed you?
I don't think it has changed me. I think what happens when people ask that question, there's a kind of human desire that is quite natural, that somehow there should be a reward if you go through some really, really difficult experience. And something in me resists that because it was far too horrible. So I actually think that in some ways it may be like a migrant experience, people who escape the war zone or whatever, that you would like to think that they're somehow better people for it. But it's a kind of, I wish I could say, oh, it changed me. And most sort of cancer narratives are driven by this thing that you would sort of say, oh, I now don't sweat the small things, or I don't worry about small things. I now have this big picture. No, it's really, it doesn't. And in some ways, there are even forms of displacement while the treatment was going on, which make you worry about small things even more, because somehow you can control those, whereas the big ones you can't. But I have to say that for some strange reason, even when I was told that I had maybe 6 months left to live, I don't remember the exact wording like that. It's there at the back of my mind. I somehow refused to believe. And it was very strange because you have these kind of 3 a.m. moments. I wrote about that. I have a poem which is called 3:18, which is when you wake up in the middle of the night and all your fears are visiting you. And so, but most of the time I was able to completely suppress that. And what was very strange was that, well, not strange, but this is me maybe, was that through what was quite a grueling long treatment and operations, etc., I only took maybe a few days sick leave. Although I could have taken more. So there was this desire to just throw myself into work, be it writing, being my university work, etc. Whereas later on, if I had flu, I would take 5 days off because it's somehow disproportionate that it is a traumatic experience. And in some ways, as trauma is, I still remember it very vividly. I remember, so even though it was 20 years ago, I remember moments of it very vividly, but I wouldn't say that it's really changed me. It's a cruel thing because you have that kind of anger as to, why me or whatever. But I think what changed me more is aging, because as you age, you see that everyone's life has moments of huge trauma, that somehow you're not peculiarly unlucky, but that was just there's a thing in Susan Sontag's one of Susan Sontag's books, Illness as Metaphor, where she says that we're all born with a passport for a particular country, and we have that other passport, which is the passport to the end of the sick, and eventually we all get to that other passport. So that was my other passport. Or my third passport, because I have two.
I'm actually quite grateful for this answer, because I think I'm coming out of a quite difficult, not health experience, but still difficult experience. And I think I do repeat to myself, this is not something I wished happened, although I have found some meaning in it. And I'm really grateful for you normalizing that. Yeah,
it's I think it is important. I think it is also important in some ways not to expect some kind of transformative knowledge, because then you're going to be disappointed. It doesn't. It's not. People will have transformative experiences who haven't had cancer, and people who have cancer. It's just part of being human.
Yeah. And there is another thing. What I was thinking in this process is not almost like I do not want to be transformed into someone who is not thirsty for life, who is cynical, who is, and it's more like transformation is actually quite possible and tangibly possible in situations like this, which is it can really leave us with some kind of lack of trust in life, and it's that transformation I was kind of resisting to happen, rather than transformation being inherent to difficult experiences.
What I have to add to that, though, just to be fair to that moment in my life, is that without it, I wouldn't have written Chernobyl Strawberries. And Chernobyl Strawberries, so this memoir, had changed my life. So in a sort of sense, I came out of it with a different direction in life. Because it became a bestseller, and I then wanted more of that. I wanted to write in that particular way rather than going back to my academic things. But I don't want to give that to cancer, because that was me. Yeah, that was me in a particular situation, deciding to, rather than sleeping or whatever, deciding to do that. So it's a bit like we started this conversation with saying that I got an editorial job because I knew Latin, and that was a lucky moment. This was perhaps a lucky decision in a difficult circumstance, but it's not that difficult circumstance could have been something else as well.
Yeah. And I would like for people who are listening to this and might not know, for you to explain the metaphor of Chernobyl Strawberries. I found it quite amazing as I was listening to your interview, the other interview, and I would like people to hear it as well.
Yes. Now, because of what is going on in Ukraine, people sometimes think it's going to be a story of Ukraine. No, but what actually happened was that I struggled when I was writing with the idea of organizing my life. However you want to narrate it, you have to begin somewhere, you have to end somewhere. I tried beginning at the beginning, which was the moment of my birth, and I found that rather boring because it required quite a lot of contextual information, where I was from, etc. So I wanted to start with a symbolic moment. And for me, the symbolic moment was when my husband-to-be, then my English boyfriend, visited Belgrade for the first time and stayed with my family, which was in April 1986, just as Chernobyl accident happened. In a field just outside Belgrade, my grandmother had tomatoes, strawberries, you name it, was growing fruit and vegetables. I was picking those strawberries and we were eating them very happily. And I even showed off by making some soft set strawberry jam. And all that under the shadow of this explosion, in part because in former Yugoslavia and Soviet Union as well, it took them the best part of a week to decide how to present it to public consumption in terms of health warnings, etc., etc. So as my husband and I then decided to travel west towards London, the further west we went, the more warnings there were. In Germany, they weren't eating mushrooms, they weren't picking blueberries. In Britain, they were killing lamb. And in Yugoslavia, we had this kind of idyll with radioactive strawberries. So I remembered, maybe because of cancer, maybe because it was so symbolic of the world I came from, which was both beautiful and toxic. I remembered that episode and I started with it. So that is the opening story of my memoir, which is the first visit, the preparation to move to England, and this strawberry jam, the kind of radioactive strawberry jam. At the same time, that became the title of a book by default, because I was struggling. I was trying to think of a good title that would connect Belgrade and London, and I couldn't think of anything. And then Word documents are saved by the first words. And because Chernobyl Strawberries were the first words, the word processing gave me my title. That was because I found that my editor and my agent referred to it as Chernobyl Strawberries, and we thought, okay, that will fly. People sometimes think that I named it Chernobyl Strawberries because of some commercial reason, because it would sell better. And my response to that was that in Germany, they didn't want Chernobyl as a title because it's still a traumatic memory. And the book is called Heimweh nach Nirgendwo, which means homesick from nowhere, for nowhere, which also comes from the book, and it sold even better with that title. So Chernobyl Strawberries had nothing to do with its marketing effects, but as a title, it's just a bit odd.
That's very interesting. Also, how people think that success is one of the things I speak in the podcast, and how people often think it's very linear. We know what's going to happen, and every person I've spoke to until now has told me I have not predicted it. I was just doing what I was knowing to do, and this happened. And it's interesting that your story kind of reflects that as well, that it's about really tapping into something unique and authentic, and that somehow is recognized without us investing so much of active energy putting into
I
it.
have to say to that, in part because I teach students of creative writing, so I feel it is my duty to say that. I have fantastically talented students who write fantastic novels that get absolutely nowhere, right? And I have stories of success. I have students who, as writers, have succeeded much more than I have in terms of getting big money and films, etc., etc. And there is always this component. So success never comes easily, in a sense that hard work and talent are required. But then there are these elements that you describe, which is unpredictability, which is that something else also happens. You hit the moment. If people could guess that, publishers would be kind of getting it all the time, but they don't. My editor in my publishing house would buy a certain number of books, opt them for publication, and then some would succeed, some wouldn't. At the moment when she's buying them, she would think that everything is going to succeed, right? Otherwise she wouldn't buy them. So it's a kind of, but I thought in what you sort of said, because in some ways I felt really lucky with my books. In spite of all the hard work, there was also an element of luck and timing. And I always feel that luck will run out, that the next one will be a complete failure. But I still write, and it doesn't really matter. I will write. But it is important to say that I had fantastic books coming through my hands that haven't found a publisher. That, it's not a kind of done deal just because something is good that it will get there.
And I think that is basically what I think it's important for me to highlight through this podcast is really the fact that the value of someone does not come exclusively from the success, the outward projection of success. Because, I mean, often I have a friend who she calls herself, hopefully for the moment, I really hope she actually manages, but she's a painter and she calls herself I'm one of these very well hidden, really good Bosnian kebab stores. They are the best in the city. But they're tiny and they're not a chain store. And this is something that I think is really important to remember, that the value of a person does not really equate with the success, and we can find their value without someone kind of canonizing them as good.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so I would like to just ask one last, it's a rapid fire question because I really like it. It kind of pulls out idiosyncrasies, and it's, is there something absurd about you that not many people know about? Something that, we would expect from a writer, a university teacher, and you're doing it and it just does not fit that image.
Oh, God. I'm now completely slowing down because most of my absurdities actually come in sort of interactions with my son and my friends. So is it absurd that I watch basketball?
Absurd enough. Absurd.
Idolize Jokic at the moment. Follow the NBA. I have that. It's a kind of, I don't have the sense of the absurd because I do hundreds of things that may be absurd to others. But, and so I have these kinds of, I don't know what I call foibles of the season. At some particular point, I don't know. I used to wear cowboy boots because I was the great fan of Lucinda Williams, the country singer from Arkansas, and so that was perhaps absurd for a university professor to have these killer boots. But maybe it isn't. I don't know. It's difficult. It's difficult when you do something to think of it as necessarily absurd. But at the moment, I think very late night basketball games from the US are definitely absurd, because I then wake up in the morning and don't know why I did it.
Yeah, I think that's absurd enough. Is there anything you want to ask me?
I would like to ask you hundreds of questions, but I have a feeling that we've been going on, and actually there is something, because I was a journalist and I used to interview people, there is something very slightly discombobulating about our conversation, because the questions all came from you and I hardly know anything about you. So I don't know what your first degree was, what you studied, how you came, all of those things I'd really love to know. How you came to do the therapeutical work that you do, which is relatively rare.
Yeah, it's interesting because I always felt it was there for me. So I was in Serbia in Petnica, and there I did molecular biomedicine and I did psychology. I always wanted to study medicine. My dad was a doctor, but somehow it felt like at that time I did not want to work with people. It was really weird. I always did, but I think what I felt there, it was more nepotistic that I could handle. And so it felt more equalizing to go to biochemistry in Belgrade. So I studied biochemistry. And then I did my PhD in Switzerland. So I was a TPA fellow in Lausanne. And then I came to England to do a postdoc. So I am actually a cancer researcher, which is interesting. I think it connects to some of my history. And then I went through a divorce, and I always had personal therapy, but I really started having intense personal therapy 2-3 times a week. And I think I can't remember the moment because it was so seamless. It felt so natural and somehow as if it was what it was meant to happen. That I just did everything that was necessary without even thinking. I knew I had to do one course and then start this other course, but it just felt like, yeah, sure, I'm just doing it. It was not even a question. And then somehow I entered into this, and it reminded me of all the love I have for working with people, because this podcast is one of that expression of that, is that curiosity for human stories. I think that's what I always had. I really love to hear people's stories. And
so sorry, I interrupted. Because you say I was meant to. Do you believe in vocation, and do you believe in destiny?
I need a second to connect with that. Vocation, I am not sure. I feel like I'm not sure for both of them. The only reason I'm sitting back with that is I'm doing family constellations, which is a very specific way of looking at how we behave based on how our family systems are working. And over again, I'm noticing how people are making choices based on unconscious drives that are embedded in their family structures. And therefore, and Jung at one point said that people repeat patterns from their family and then they call it fate. And that's why I kind of stepped back of saying it's destiny, because I think what feels like destiny is probably like a drive that we haven't worked with. But I started to believe in something which I don't have words yet before, which is something that I can make decisions. You called gumption, like that, from the gut decisions, which are right for me now. And to be able, and hopefully be able to do that for the rest of my life, even if that means I'm not going to be a therapist anymore, I'm suddenly going to be a painter or a writer. So my hope is to be able to stay in touch with that gut enough to not be closed into what I think of my identity is. And I think that maybe to some extent is colored with the times, because we can change much more easily because of all the online knowledge that's available versus from what it was before. So.
The reason I mentioned gut feeling decisions in relation to gumption is that gumption is really, in Serbian, the word is odvažnost. So it's a different kind of courage, right? So it's not necessarily gut feeling, but it is, you're acting like that. Whereas courage, it's a different thing. So it is interesting. But the reason I was asking about destiny is that Aaron Curtin, my most recent book, in part, one of the things that I was kind of thinking through is the differences between East and West. And in the West, you have this idea of, and I'm really simplifying, because I don't like to flatten these things into stereotype, but this idea of personal improvement, self-improvement, you have all those books, self-help, and you only need to wish something strong enough and it will happen to you, and that kind of thing. Whereas in the East, and maybe because our regimes were different, etc., you have this kind of idea that destiny is something that hits you. You have no kind of power to change. It's like the kind of notion of kismet in Islam. It's sort of something that happens to you. So the fact that you may want to be X or Y has nothing to do with it. That certain things are preordained. It's really, so I wasn't really before that thinking about it so much, but now in the last maybe 2 years, I became quite preoccupied with it, because people would ask me, were you always meant to be a writer? And I was writing poetry when I was 4. So literally, I learned to write when I was 3, and it was first things. I even know the first poems. So, how do you disentangle that? Are you meant to, or as you say, your family thing is actually quite fascinating. I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think now I am somehow in the middle way. I think partly Serbia, there is a little bit of fatalistic thinking. Well, the East is that, it's almost like slightly disempowering, which doesn't take into account actually our personal agency. Whereas I feel like the West is taking personal agency to the extent that doesn't understand the complexities of life. And I'm actually quite grateful to be born in both, like, to have Zaidi Zaidi as a song, and to know that there are cycles of life, and there is something that I need to release into, and to have faith. And I think I started to regain a little bit of not magical thinking, but faith, which is different for me. And I've learned that actually through my paintings, because they started to speak to me in a completely different level, which is, I started to have information before my brain and words were coming up. I would draw a paint, and I would draw something, and then 3 days after, and I would call it, for example, flowering. And 3 days after, several people at the same time would tell me, something's happening to you, you are flowering. And so I started to see a sort of nuance there, which I think the West is cut off from, which is only like, give me numbers, give me data, give me that kind of thing. And I think both have values. And I think one of the people I interviewed, he calls the people like this poet scientist. I think we can't do without both.
Absolutely. The contrast in what you describe is that if you think you can do nothing, and you become passive, and you sort of see yourself as the victim of the system. And then on the other hand, if you believe in personal agency too much, it is very often a way for the system to absolve itself. It's somehow your fault because you're not succeeding. Whereas in fact, the systemic thing can be a problem. So yes. So those paintings that I see behind you, they're yours.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Because I was looking at it as we were talking, trying to see this tree and heart and two halves and trying to interpret. It's rather fascinating.
Yeah, that is actually with the help of this girl I was talking about, because she calls this process intentional creativity, which is kind of creativity which also brings you knowledge about yourself, and it's called the United Kingdom actually. And there was a time where like one of the colors were really really like that, and I think there is a symbolic in that for me, in that I came here to unite parts of myself which were really torn.
And why here? Why?
I don't have an answer. That was a very intuitive move. I feel like, one of those things that life can be lived forwards but understood backwards. But I could make a lot of meaning now, but I think there was something about being enough east and west that I could find. I feel like London, if I could stay to live here, I think I would, and I hope I will, because it reconciles. It's like a balancing principle. There is so much diversity that if I want, I can go and dance Greek, Bulgarian dances, Serbian. There is a Serbian church. I can also go to African drumming. I can go to. So there are so many parts of me that I somehow can express here. And so it feels very united. Like my inner kingdom is somehow able to coexist in this place, which has so many different facets.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. Okay, I really want to thank you, and I really like this version of the interview where we back and forth. So if we do it in Serbian, I would really love that it be like this. And yeah, I really want to thank you for your time, to wish you a happy belated birthday.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll do it in Serbian some other time.
Yeah.
Good.
You have just heard the story of Vesna Goldsworthy, a novelist, memoirist, and poet with many years' experience in teaching, creative writing, and English literature. She is currently a professor at the Exeter University, and she came to academia after a career at the BBC and continues to produce and present radio programs. Her work includes a novel Gorsky, a best-selling memoir Chernobyl Strawberries, and Inventing Ruritania, the Imperialism of Imagination, which is recognized as one of the key contributions to the study of Balkan and European identity. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and hopefully you will like and subscribe so that these stories can reach more people.